Minnesota, 2006. The first snow of the season had just dusted the small town of Ironwood Falls, a quiet community surrounded by frozen lakes and pine forests that looked like something out of a postcard. But beneath the calm beauty of that December evening, something was terribly wrong. 21-year-old Emily Hartman was late coming home from her shift at the Ironwood Cafe, a place where everyone knew her by name. Emily was a junior at St. Cloud State University, studying early childhood education. She was the kind of person people remembered, always smiling, always helping, with a warmth that seemed to light up even the coldest Minnesota day. Her mother, Margaret Hartman, watched the clock nervously as it ticked past 9 p.m. Emily always called if she was running late, but the phone stayed silent. Her father, Tom, a former volunteer firefighter, drove the snow-covered back roads toward the cafe, convinced she might have had car trouble. When he arrived, the building was dark, the parking lot empty except for a single set of tire tracks leading toward the highway, and Emily's blue Honda Civic parked neatly under a streetlight. Her purse was on the passenger seat. The driver's door was unlocked. Her keys were missing. Within hours, the Ironwood Falls Police Department launched a search. Deputies trudged through knee-deep snow, scanning ditches and wooded areas with flashlights, while volunteers organized at the town hall. The frigid air bit at their faces as they called Emily's name into the darkness, the sound echoing across the frozen landscape. The next morning, local news stations began reporting on her disappearance. The entire community of Ironwood Falls, population just under 3,000, rallied around the Hartmans. Flyers with Emily's photograph, a bright-eyed young woman with chestnut hair and a shy, hopeful smile, were taped to every storefront window and telephone pole in town. Investigators retraced her final steps that night. A waitress at the cafe remembered Emily staying late to close up. The security camera in the kitchen captured her locking the cash register and leaving through the back door at 8:43 p.m. She waved at a co-worker across the parking lot. The last confirmed sighting. At first, police suspected a carjacking or abduction by a stranger passing through on the interstate. But the snow told its own story. Fresh tire tracks led away from the cafe, yet there were no footprints other than Emily's own. The realization chilled detectives. Whoever took her likely did it fast, and likely knew exactly what they were doing. For the Hartmans, the days blurred together. Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept Emily's phone on the kitchen counter, volume turned all the way up, praying for a call that never came. Tom spent his days helping the search teams comb the woods near the cafe and the frozen shoreline of Lake Ironwood. He refused to give up, convinced his daughter was out there somewhere waiting to be found. The investigation grew in scale. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, BCA, joined the case, sending forensic specialists to examine Emily's car. They dusted for prints, collected fabric fibers and vacuumed the interior for trace evidence. Inside the driver's door, they found a small smear of blood. Too little to tell whose it was, but enough to send to the state lab. Tips poured in. Some claimed to have seen a blue pickup truck parked near the cafe earlier that night. Others swore they heard a woman scream near the old paper mill on the edge of town. But none of the leads panned out. By Christmas Eve, just 2 weeks after Emily's disappearance, the search was quietly scaled back. Volunteers went home. The flyers faded in the cold wind. What had started as a community crusade slowly turned into quiet despair. Margaret refused to take down the Christmas decorations, leaving the lights on every night in case Emily somehow found her way home. Tom built a small wooden cross near the highway, marking the last place she was seen, and visited it every morning before sunrise. Weeks turned into months. The case went cold. Investigators kept Emily's case file open, revisiting it every few months, hoping new evidence might surface. Detectives interviewed former boyfriends, co-workers, and even strangers who'd stopped at the cafe that night. Everyone had theories: a jealous ex, a random drifter, human trafficking, but none fit the facts. Then in April 2008, a fisherman discovered a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch near the thawing edge of Lake Ironwood. Forensic testing confirmed it matched the uniform Emily had been wearing the night she vanished. Dive teams searched the lake for days, breaking through thin ice and murky water, but nothing else was found. It was the first real clue in nearly a year, and it reignited hope briefly, but without a body, a weapon or a suspect, there was little detectives could do. The case once again slipped into silence. The Hartmans never stopped searching. They joined online forums for families of the missing, worked with private investigators, and spoke at college campuses about safety awareness. Margaret kept Emily's bedroom exactly as she left it. The unmade bed, the half-finished scrapbook on her desk, the college acceptance letters pinned neatly to a corkboard. She would sit in that room for hours, whispering prayers into the quiet air. A new detective, Rachel Klein, joined the Ironwood Falls Police Department and took an interest in the cold case. She was young but meticulous, the kind of investigator who noticed details others missed. Rachel spent nights poring over the original files, retracing every lead and cross-checking timelines. One thing bothered her. The tire tracks found beside Emily's car had never been matched to any vehicle. In 2006, the technology to digitally map tread patterns was limited. By 2011, new software allowed her to run comparisons against a national tire database. The results pointed to a rare set of off-road tires used primarily on older pickup trucks. She revisited the original witness statements. Several residents had mentioned a blue pickup truck seen around town in the days leading up to the disappearance. One name appeared twice: Daniel Morrow, a local mechanic who had briefly worked at the Ironwood Cafe fixing appliances that same fall. He'd moved away in 2007, just months after Emily vanished. Rachel tracked him down to a small town in North Dakota, working under a different last name. But when she reached out to authorities there, she learned he'd died in a car accident in 2009. Still, something about him nagged at her. His work records, his sudden departure, and the timing of it all. She ordered a search of the property where Morrow had lived in 2006, but no physical evidence linking him to the crime was ever found. The case stalled once again. Years passed, but technology kept advancing. In 2018, Minnesota's BCA began retesting unsolved case evidence using modern DNA amplification techniques. Rachel submitted the small blood sample taken from Emily's car back in 2006. For nearly 2 decades, it had yielded nothing. This time it produced a partial DNA profile, too incomplete to identify a suspect directly, but enough to enter into the national database known as CODIS. A few weeks later, a genealogical analyst reached out. The sample had produced a familial match, someone distantly related to an individual already in the system. The lead pointed to a family from North Dakota, relatives of none other than Daniel Morrow. Rachel's hands trembled as she read the report. For the first time in 19 years, she felt the case shifting, the faint stirrings of truth rising from the ice. It was the fall of 2023 when Detective Rachel Klein sat once again in the small, wood-paneled conference room at the Ironwood Falls Police Department. A thin layer of dust covered the casebox marked Hartman, Emily, missing person, 2006. Inside were the same photos and evidence bags she'd stared at for years, the cafe parking lot snapshots, the blood sample vial, and the faded flyer with Emily's smiling face. But this time there was something new. A manila envelope from the Minnesota BCA stamped urgent, DNA re-evaluation results. Rachel tore it open with shaking hands. The partial DNA profile recovered from the car door, after 19 years of storage, had finally yielded a familial match. The genetic link pointed to a small family in Bismarck, North Dakota, whose deceased relative, Daniel Morrow, was listed as a likely source. The room fell silent as she read the report. Daniel Morrow, the quiet mechanic who'd vanished after Emily disappeared, was no longer just a name on paper. For the first time, the investigation had direction, a thread connecting the past to the present. Rachel briefed the chief, who immediately authorized a reopening of the case. The Ironwood Falls police partnered with the BCA's cold case unit to reconstruct the timeline surrounding Morrow's final years. They combed through employment files, property records, and vehicle registrations. One document stood out, a receipt from 2006 showing that Morrow had purchased new all-terrain tires just weeks before Emily vanished. The tread matched the rare pattern discovered near her car. Armed with new technology, investigators mapped cell tower data and historical GPS pings from Morrow's old work phone, a device long archived in evidence from an unrelated property dispute. The records placed him within a half-mile radius of the Ironwood Cafe at precisely 8:45 p.m. on the night Emily disappeared. For Rachel, it felt like breathing after years underwater. She stared at the glowing screen in the dim evidence lab, whispering, "We've got him." When Margaret Hartman answered the knock on her door, she found Detective Klein standing there, snow melting from her boots, her expression steady but compassionate. It had been nearly 2 decades since Margaret had first met her, a young officer at the time, and in that moment, all those years collapsed into one. "Mrs. Hartman," Rachel said softly, "I think we found something." Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. "Please tell me it's real this time." Rachel nodded. "It's real." The news rippled through Ironwood Falls like a winter storm. Local media revived old footage, replaying the same interviews from 2006, the same candlelight vigils, the same pleas for information. Now there was finally hope, and a name. But hope came with pain. Each headline reopened wounds the Hartman family had spent years learning to live with. Tom Hartman, older now, his hair turned white, told reporters, "We've waited 19 years for an answer. I don't know if I'm ready for what that answer might be." Detectives traveled to Bismarck to speak with Morrow's surviving relatives. His younger sister, Lydia Morrow, greeted them cautiously, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. She hadn't seen Daniel in years before his death. "He was always different after he left Minnesota," she said quietly. "He didn't talk about Ironwood Falls. Every time I asked, he'd change the subject." Rachel and her team explained the DNA connection and asked permission to search Lydia's family property, an old cabin Daniel had occasionally used for hunting trips. Lydia hesitated, then handed over the keys. "If it helps that girl's family," she said, "then take whatever you need." The cabin sat deep in the woods outside Bismarck, surrounded by frozen ponds and bare trees. The interior was sparse, a small cot, a rusted stove, a wall of tools. But it was what they found under the floorboards that made Rachel's heart pound. A buried lockbox sealed with duct tape and rusted shut. Inside were a few faded photographs, women's jewelry, and a folded newspaper clipping from the Ironwood Falls Chronicle, dated December 15, 2006. The headline read, "Local college student missing. Search expands statewide." Among the photos was one of Emily Hartman, smiling behind the counter at the cafe. Forensic analysts catalogued every item. DNA swabs from the jewelry produced a perfect match to Emily. The evidence, though old and degraded, was enough to officially link Morrow to the disappearance. Investigators theorized that Morrow, who worked late at the cafe repairing appliances, had become fixated on Emily. When she left work that snowy night, he likely offered her a ride, then attacked her when she refused. His mechanical expertise and access to secluded rural areas would have made it easy to conceal evidence. Still, one question haunted Rachel. Where was Emily? She ordered a full review of every property Morrow had ever worked on within a 50-mile radius of Ironwood Falls. Old landscaping invoices led them to a remote farm near the edge of Pine River County. The landowner, An elderly man named Earl Peterson remembered Morrow repairing equipment there in 2006. He asked if he could store some old junk behind the barn, Peterson recalled. Said it was scrap metal. I never checked. In December 2024, under the brittle grey light of a Minnesota winter morning, excavation crews began searching the overgrown area behind Peterson's barn. Beneath a collapsed pile of rusted fencing and frozen soil, cadaver dogs alerted. Investigators dug carefully, their breaths visible in the cold air. What they unearthed brought 19 years of searching to an end. Partial skeletal remains wrapped in decayed canvas. Beside them lay a tarnished silver pendant, engraved with the letter E. Forensic odontologists confirmed the remains belonged to Emily Hartman. The news broke that afternoon, sending shockwaves through Ironwood Falls. Residents gathered outside the Hartman home, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes on the snow-covered porch. The town's church bells rang for the first time in years, a somber tribute to the girl who had never been forgotten. Margaret and Tom stood together at the press conference, holding hands. Margaret's voice trembled as she said, "For 19 years we've prayed for the truth. Now we have it. Emily's finally coming home." The BCA's final report concluded that Daniel Morrow had abducted and murdered Emily Hartman on the night of December 12, 2006. His remains from the 2009 car accident were exhumed for DNA comparison, confirming the match beyond doubt. The blood found on Emily's car door was his, likely transferred during a struggle. The case was officially closed on January 10, 2025, 19 years. 28 days after Emily vanished, Rachel Klein stood quietly in her office, staring at the closed case file. For her, it wasn't triumph, only relief. "Justice doesn't always look like a courtroom," she said softly to a reporter. "Sometimes it's simply giving a family their truth." In the months that followed, Ironwood Falls transformed its grief into remembrance. The town council approved plans for the Emily Hartman Memorial Scholarship, supporting students pursuing careers in forensic science. The Ironwood Cafe, where Emily had spent her last evening, reopened under new ownership, her favorite photo hanging near the counter with a small plaque that read, "Forever in our hearts." At the dedication ceremony, Tom Hartman stood before a crowd of neighbors and old friends. "Emily's gone," he said, his voice breaking, "but the people who refused to forget her, the officers, the volunteers, the strangers who searched in the cold, they're the reason we're standing here today." Margaret, clutching a white rose, whispered, "She finally came home." The Hartman case became a model for cold case units across the Midwest, proving how forensic genealogy could breathe new life into long-forgotten investigations. Law enforcement agencies began reopening dozens of unsolved files inspired by Emily's story and Detective Klein's relentless persistence. For Rachel, the closure was bittersweet. On the day she officially archived the Hartman case, she placed a small card on top of the box. It read, "Justice revealed 19 years later." She turned off the lights and stepped outside into the falling snow, the town quiet beneath a soft white blanket, the same way it had been the night Emily disappeared. Only this time the silence felt peaceful. The arrest and discovery sent a wave of emotion through Ironwood Falls. For nearly 2 decades, the town had lived under the weight of an unanswered question. Now that question had a name, a face, and a truth that was both devastating and strangely comforting. News crews filled the narrow streets, broadcasting live in front of the Hartman home. Reporters spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had finally settled over the town. People who had lived their entire lives in Ironwood Falls stood together, candles flickering in the cold night air, watching as the Hartman family emerged to thank everyone who had helped bring their daughter home. For Margaret and Tom, it was not the ending they prayed for, but it was an ending. They sat side by side in their living room, surrounded by stacks of letters from strangers across the country, parents who understood, officers who admired their strength, students inspired by Emily's story. Margaret ran her fingers across one letter from a young woman studying forensic science in California. "I chose this path because of Emily," it read. "She taught me that even cold cases can warm back to life." Tom had grown quieter over the years, his body frail but his eyes still sharp. He often stared out the window toward the snow-covered highway, where the wooden cross he'd planted nearly 2 decades earlier still stood. "I thought I'd have to die not knowing," he told a local reporter. "But I didn't, and that's enough." Detective Rachel Klein visited the Hartmans one final time that winter. She didn't wear her badge or carry her notebook. She came as a friend. Margaret greeted her with a hug that lingered longer than words could fill. "You gave us back our daughter," she said, her voice trembling. Rachel shook her head. "Emily was never gone from you," she whispered. "We just had to find her again." The following week, the remains were returned to the family. The funeral was held at St. Luke's Church, the same place where search parties had once gathered, where prayer circles had formed, and where hope had flickered stubbornly, even in the darkest winters. The pews overflowed. People stood in the aisles holding white lilies. The town's high school choir sang softly as snow fell outside, blanketing the cemetery in silence. After the service, as the casket was lowered into the ground, Margaret placed a small blue notebook inside, Emily's old journal, filled with dreams and doodles and plans for the future she never got to have. Tom added a photograph of the 3 of them taken the summer before she disappeared, Emily's arms slung around both of them, her grin radiant under the Minnesota sun. The wind howled across the open fields, but inside that circle of mourners the world was still. In the weeks after the burial, Ironwood Falls began to change. The case that had once defined the town's pain now defined its resilience. Local schools began hosting annual safety workshops, teaching students about awareness, technology, and trust. A scholarship in Emily's name was established, funded by donations that poured in from across the country. Every spring, one deserving student received the award, a student who embodied the same kindness, curiosity, and determination Emily had been known for. The cafe where she worked reopened under new management, its interior renovated, but its spirit unchanged. Near the entrance hung a framed photograph of Emily behind the counter, smiling at the camera. Beneath it, a simple brass plate read, "In loving memory of Emily Hartman, always in our hearts." Customers often paused in front of it, some whispering prayers, others just taking a quiet moment. Before ordering their coffee, Rachel Klein was promoted to lead the state's new cold case and forensic genealogy task force. She often used the Hartman case in training sessions for new recruits, walking them through the mistakes, the missed clues, and the eventual breakthroughs that led to justice. Persistence, she would tell them, isn't about chasing what's gone. It's about listening for what's still speaking. Her words became something of a mantra across Minnesota's investigative units. In the spring of 2025, a small documentary crew arrived in Ironwood Falls to film a segment on the case. They interviewed neighbors, classmates, and former officers. Many still struggled to describe what Emily's loss had meant. "She was part of this place," one teacher said, standing outside the old schoolhouse. "When she disappeared, it felt like the light went out. Now it's like it finally came back." During filming, the crew captured an unplanned moment, Margaret sitting alone on the porch, holding Emily's guitar. Her hands brushed lightly over the strings, though she didn't play. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I imagine she's still singing somewhere. Maybe that's foolish, but it keeps me breathing." Her words, raw and unguarded, became the closing line of the documentary, and when it aired months later, it brought viewers across the country to tears. Even those who had never heard of Ironwood Falls before now felt connected to its story, to Emily's story. Social media filled with posts honoring her, using the hashtag #JusticeForEmily. Law enforcement agencies cited the case as proof of how technological progress could give victims their voices back, even decades later. It wasn't just about DNA or databases, it was about the people who refused to stop looking. For Rachel, that refusal became her life's work. She spent countless nights reviewing other cold cases, looking for those small forgotten details that might mean everything. Each file she opened carried the weight of families like the Hartmans, waiting for the phone call that might finally change everything. "We owe it to them," she often said to her team. "If 19 years can give one family the truth, imagine what we can do for others." By the end of that year, her task force had helped solve 3 other long-dormant cases. The state awarded her a commendation, but she avoided the ceremony, choosing instead to spend that evening driving out to Lake Ironwood. She parked near the frozen water's edge, stepped out into the biting wind, and looked up at the stars reflecting faintly on the ice. She whispered, "We found you," then stood there until the cold forced her back inside. Ironwood Falls never forgot Emily. Each December, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the town gathered by the lake for a candlelight vigil. People of all ages came, some who had searched for her in 2006, others who had only heard her story growing up. Margaret and Tom still led the gathering, standing beneath a simple banner that read, "Hope never dies." They lit the first candle together, passing the flame from one person to another until the entire shoreline glowed with a soft golden light. One year, a small child tugged on Margaret's coat and asked, "Did Emily ever find her way home?" Margaret knelt down, her eyes glistening. "Yes," she said with a faint smile. "She did." The crowd stood in silence as the candles flickered in the cold wind, their reflections dancing on the frozen lake. And though the air was filled with grief, there was also peace, the kind that only comes when truth finally replaces uncertainty. Even after all the cameras left and the news cycle moved on, Ironwood Falls carried Emily's memory quietly, like a heartbeat under snow. The cafe stayed open, the scholarship grew, the cross by the highway was repaired each spring. Life continued, changed but enduring. And for those who had loved her, the words of the judge who closed the case remained etched in their minds. No amount of time can erase what happened, but truth has a way of surviving, even when everything else fades. Rachel sometimes visited the Hartmans without notice, bringing flowers or just sitting with them on the porch. They didn't always talk about Emily. Sometimes they just shared coffee, letting the silence speak for what words never could. On one of those visits, Tom looked up from his chair and said quietly, "If Emily could see all this, I think she'd be proud." Rachel smiled faintly. "I think she already does." As winter gave way to spring, the snow melted from the fields, revealing new grass and fresh earth. The cross by the road still stood, weathered but strong, and every time the wind passed through the pines, it carried a sound that almost resembled laughter, a soft, distant echo of the girl who had once called this place home. Months turned into years, and the story of Emily Hartman began to live on far beyond Ironwood Falls. What had started as a small-town tragedy became a symbol of resilience, proof that time could bend but not erase the truth. Across Minnesota, police departments re-examined old evidence lockers, opening boxes that had gathered dust for decades. Some officers, newly inspired, requested forensic genealogy training. Others reached out to Rachel Klein for advice, eager to learn how one small town had achieved what many thought impossible. In interviews, Rachel always credited the Hartman family first. "They never stopped believing," she told one reporter. "We had the science, but they had the strength." Her humility became part of the story, a quiet reminder that behind every case file were real people, holding on through years of uncertainty. By 2027, Emily's case had been featured in national media outlets, true crime podcasts and documentaries. But the tone was never sensational. It was reverent. The focus wasn't on the crime. It was on endurance. The narrator of one documentary described it best. Some stories